Hey everyone, welcome back for video number 3, European Middle Ages, and today we are going to talk about feudalism. So I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. And minimize myself again. And we can get this part of the PowerPoint started. All right, so let's talk about feudalism. You may remember feudalism when we talked about feudalism in Japan. So feudalism is the same thing in Europe. So it's just a different place where we're seeing the same thing happening. Do you remember the definition of feudalism? It is a political, economic, and social system. So it's political, it involves the government. It's social, it involves the people, and it's economic, it involves the money. And it's based on loyalty, the holding of land, and on military service. So around 900 CE, we see feudalism start to emerge in Europe. The feudal system is based on those specific rights and obligations that the people living within the system have to one another. In exchange for military protection, a lord granted land to a vassal. So these are some key words you are going to need to know the definitions to. A lord is a landowner. A fief is what that land given by a lord to a vassal is called. And a vassal is a person who receives that land, who receives a fief. This is what the European feudal pyramid looked like. So just how in Japan there are people, or in this case a person, an organization that is outside of the main pyramid, in Europe that is the Pope and the church. They are above, outside of the pyramid. At the top of the pyramid we have the monarch, the king. There are nobles, the wealthy, the knights, and the vassals. Then on the next line, we have the merchants, the farmers, the craftsmen, and at the very bottom of the European feudal pyramid, we have peasants and serfs. So your status determined your prestige and your power, your ability to have money and to do well in life. Social class was inherited. You were not born a peasant and then suddenly became a noble. You were born in and then stayed as whatever social class you were born into. The very large majority of people in Europe during this time were peasants. And most, although not all, but most of those peasants were serfs. Serfs were people who could not lawfully leave the place that they were born. They were not slaves. They were tied to the land. A lord couldn't sell them as property, but they were not able to leave that land. They were tied to the place where they were born, to the estate that they were born onto. That estate, the land that a lord owned, was called a manor. A manor system was based on economic arrangement. So we see the economy being a very large part of feudalism in Europe. The vassal, the person who received land, provided serfs with housing, with farmland, and protection. So they gave them all of these things. They gave them housing, they gave them land to farm, they protected them in times of war, and in return, the serfs tended the land, they took care of it, they grew things on it, and they maintained the estate. They took care of that area. Peasant women were not exempt from any of this. Peasant women worked just as hard as the men did. They shared in all of the work, including that very hard labor of farm work. All peasants, whether they were serfs or not, although again, most were serfs, but all of them owed a lord certain duties. Lords tended to keep some land for their own use, but most of it was farmed by peasants and serfs. The lord controlled every single thing that happened on his land. Nothing happened without the say of the lord who owned it. Peasants also very rarely traveled from their own manor. So people would live be born, would live, and would die within the same 5 to 10 mile radius. And about 15 to 30 families lived in the village on a manor. So we're looking at, a decent number of people living in this area, but at the same time, those were the only people that anyone ever knew. Those families were the only families anyone was ever allowed to be acquainted with. Fields, pastures, woodland areas, they all surrounded the village. So there'd be a village on part of the manor. You'd have maybe an area with farmland. You'd have some forest land. You'd have some open field. You'd have all these different areas surrounding the village. And all of that was part of the Lord's estate, part of his manor. And the manor was largely self-sufficient. It wasn't easy living on a manor, though. The life of being on a manor was very, very harsh. Peasants had to pay high taxes to the Lord to live there. They often paid those taxes in what they were growing, in their labor, not always in actual coin or money, but with what they had the ability to give with. They also paid taxes to the village priest. This was called a tithe. The church tax was called the tithe. Serfs tended to live in crowded cottages. They had a simple diet. Those 15 to 30 families did not live in 15 to 30 different houses or cottages. They lived together in very small, crowded cottages, and they lived on basic foods. Life for serfs was work, and then some more work, and then some more work, and then, hey, after that, some more work too. They did not have an easy life in any way. They had very few rest days, very few times when they were not expected to be working. The average life expectancy during this time was about 35 years. So for me, at 34 and a half years old, I would be coming up to the average life expectancy, and I would be considered a very, very old lady. Serfs, however, did accept their life as part of the church's teachings. You may be asking yourself why anyone would be willing to subject themselves to this. Well, they were taught that this is what God wanted them to do, that it was their part of life to be a serf. And so they accepted that God wanted them to be a serf, and it was part of what God wanted. So they accepted their life. Feudalism was a system that covered many different areas. Again, like I said, it covered their economic, their money, it covered their government, okay, their political life, and their social life, how people interacted with one another. So for your work to accompany this video, you are going to take a look at some readings about feudalism, okay? So CCP, you have one set of readings. It's a couple set of readings with some questions. And then honors and advanced, you have another set, some primary source documents. You're going to take a look at those and answer the questions that accompany them. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know.